Yesterday, Putin officially announced a change to Russia's nuclear doctrine in response to the release of long-range missiles for Ukraine. And that's why we are now at a state of red alert, because these changes to the doctrine are truly significant. Additionally, Putin has presented a new advanced superweapon with a range of kilometers. Let's take a look at the whole situation together. This is really extremely concerning. 2001. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching a movie that is playing in slow motion and really has a bad ending in store for us. Percent of movies have a happy ending, and I hope that the war in Ukraine does not belong to the last 1% where there is no happy ending. Because the situation in Ukraine is currently escalating to such an extent that it can really take your breath away, because now Putin has significantly and drastically changed his nuclear doctrine in response to the long-range missiles, we are indeed truly in a state of red alert. The Bild newspaper reported, "A new threat to the West," as Putin simplifies the use of nuclear weapons. Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin announced an adjustment to Russia's nuclear doctrine during his meeting of the Russian Security Council. He states that in the future, nuclear powers supporting an attack by another country on Russia will be considered aggressors. Well, the countries in question can certainly be counted on one hand. This undoubtedly applies to both the States, the British and the French, certainly. All three of these countries are nuclear powers themselves, and they are supporting another country in its attack on Russia. At least when they release the long-range missiles for Ukraine that then fly directly towards Russia, for sure. That was indeed exactly the topic of conversation last week, especially when the British and American foreign ministers were in Ukraine. It was very important and significant. But of course, indeed this week where Zelensky himself is in the States, Zelensky has officially presented his victory plan and stated that there will be no peace negotiations with Russia. Russia must and should be militarily defeated, and among other things, long-range missiles are expected to help with this. And just last week, Putin gave an official interview and clearly stated that Ukraine cannot operate these long-range missiles on its own. Clearly, it needs satellites that it does not have, and it requires assistance with target acquisition and guidance, as it is not capable of doing this itself. Chancellor Olaf Scholz had said exactly the same thing. Accordingly, those countries that in fact release their long-range missiles would indeed intervene as active participants in the war. Actually, at least that is how Putin has announced it. And that is exactly why the Russian president is now taking decisive action and has adjusted his nuclear doctrine. The Bild newspaper literally wrote that Putin said, "I would like to draw your attention to something else." The current version of the document indeed suggests that aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear weapon state, specifically Ukraine, but with the involvement or direct support of a nuclear weapon state, should in fact be considered a joint attack on the Russian Federation. In 2001, the Kremlin released a video of Putin's speech at the beginning of the Security Council's meeting on nuclear deterrence. Putin did not comment on whether the amended document provides for a nuclear response from Russia to such an attack. However, the danger of becoming a target of a Russian counterstrike is increasing, especially for Western nuclear powers like the USA and France. The existing doctrine stated that Moscow could respond to the use of nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction against itself or an ally, as well as in the case of aggression against the Russian Federation using conventional weapons if the existence of the state itself is threatened. And this now means nothing other than that the threshold for a Russian nuclear strike has been significantly lowered. And this now also applies to attacks by Ukraine if they are supported by other nuclear powers. And in doing so, this Russian counterstrike is indeed directed not only against Ukraine, but also directed against its partners and allies. And that's why Putin has now also presented a new advanced superweapon, which has a range of approximately. And since the circumference of the Earth is Kali Kial, this weapon can reach any point in the world. 2001 if it can be fired in both directions. And this new weapon, technically, called the Burevestnik, has indeed been reported on sporadically in the past, but now Putin has announced that several test flights have been successful, and the weapon is ready for deployment. The news portal Reuters wrote the following: exclusive US researchers find probable launch site of Russia's new nuclear power missile. 2 US researchers, after extensive investigation and analysis, have likely identified the launch site for Russia's new nuclear missile, the M30 Burevestnik, which President Vladimir Putin has described as invincible and a significant advancement in military technology. Putin says that the weapon referred to by the West as SSC Skyfall has nearly unlimited range and could bypass the US missile defense. Some Western experts question his claim and the strategic value of the Burevestnik. They say he will not grant Moscow any capabilities it does not already possess, and indeed, there is a risk of a radiation-emitting incident. Okay, so this needs to be absorbed for a moment because Putin is presenting a new super weapon according to his statements, and the West claims that this weapon is completely ineffective and has no new capabilities at all. And that reminds me a lot of the Western newspaper reports back then that claimed the Russians were completely desperate in 2001 and were already fighting with folding spades. I just have the feeling that the West is once again underestimating the Russian president and is really trying to provoke being hit by one of those Burevestniks. Definitely, absolutely. And when you also consider that Putin has now tightened his nuclear doctrine at the same time, then for me, that is really the biggest hint possible. And I sincerely and genuinely hope that these new and advanced monster weapons will absolutely never be used. But I really have great concerns that the West will provoke the Russians with the long-range missiles to such an extent that they will then take decisive action. How do you assess the current situation? Feel free to share your assessment in the comments under the video. 2001.